No one wants a fat girl, sir. But I can nurse the baby, said the cook. The widower said, then stay. Carter's Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Late autumn, 1889. The wind came cold from the high country, cutting through the yellow grass and whispering down the ridges. Out here, you could hear everything. The creak of a gate half a mile off, the whine of a coyote, the sigh of a house remembering when it used to be full. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the Bellamy Ranch house, its wheels hissing through the dust. When the driver shouted end of the line, the only passenger left inside gathered her satchel and stepped down. She was a broad woman, shoulders square, cheeks red from the cold, her hair pinned tight beneath a handkerchief. Her name was Margaret Doyle, though most called her Maggie. The coat she wore was mended twice, but clean. She stood on the porch a moment, eyes moving over the land, brown grass, split fence rails, the slow smoke of a chimney. A baby was crying somewhere inside the house, hard and steady, like it had been crying a long time. No one came to greet her. Maggie tightened her grip on the satchel. The stagecoach rumbled away, leaving her alone in the whistling quiet. She knocked once, twice. No answer. The baby's cry rose, shrill and desperate. She pushed the door open. The kitchen was cold, the stove barely alive. Dishes were stacked unwashed. A feeding bottle lay on its side, beside an empty cradle blanket. The sound of that baby's cry cut through the walls like a blade. Maggie followed it down the hall. At the end, in a small room with a single uncurtained window, she found him, a boy, maybe 4 months old, face red and slick with tears. There now, she whispered, stepping close. Her voice carried the soft lilt of County Clare, smoothed by years of American dust. She bent down, gathered the child in her arms with the easy surety of a woman who'd done it before. "Sure now, Emma Croy, hush now, my heart." The words came in Old Gaelic, worn and gentle. She began to hum. Within minutes, the baby's sobs faded to hiccups. He pressed his cheek against her shoulder, his breath slowing, trusting. That was when the floor creaked behind her. Maggie turned. A man stood in the doorway, tall, lean, his face lined not by years but by grief. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his hands rough, his eyes pale as river ice. James Bellamy, 32, rancher, widower. "You're the new cook," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse. Maggie nodded, bouncing the baby lightly. "Margaret Doyle, sir. Most call me Maggie." James looked at the baby, now sleeping in her arms. His jaw tightened. Then his gaze lifted to her, not cruel, not curious, just measuring. Maggie met his eyes. She didn't flinch. When he said nothing, she filled the silence herself, softly but without apology. "No one wants a fat girl, sir, but I can nurse the baby." The words hung between them like a challenge, or maybe a plea. Not for approval, for purpose. James stared at her for a long breath. Something old and hollow in his face shifted. Then he nodded once. Then stay. And he turned and walked away. Maggie didn't exhale until he was gone. She looked down at the child asleep against her breast. She hadn't planned to stay long. She never did. But maybe here, maybe this once, she wouldn't be asked to disappear. Dawn came pale and cold over the hollow. The light crept through the kitchen window in soft, dusty bands. Maggie was already up, sleeves rolled, apron tied. She stirred oats in the iron pot, added a handful of dried berries, and let the smell of butter and sugar fill the room. The house was quiet except for the low whistle of the kettle and the baby's soft breaths in the crib beside the stove. When the door opened, James Bellamy stepped in. He looked as though he hadn't slept, hair uncombed, shirt rumpled. He didn't speak, just reached for a cup of coffee, nodded, and left a slip of paper on the counter. Feed baby at 11. Check fence corner behind barn. Lost 3 calves. Then he walked out again. That became their way. He left notes. She answered with meals, clean linen, and the sound of humming that filled the empty house. The baby began to smile again. The house warmed with small things, bread rising, soap bubbles catching morning light, the quiet clatter of dishes. Maggie never sat at the table with James. She took her meals by the window, looking out at the golden hills. From that little nook, she'd sometimes see him riding back from the range, tall in the saddle, hat low, shoulders set against the wind. He never waved, but he always slowed as he passed the kitchen window, glancing in once before heading to the barn. That was enough. It was the kind of noticing that mattered. Out in the yard, the ranch hands talked the way men do when they think kindness won't follow them. Bellamy hired a nursemaid. One said, big one, could hide a sack of feed under her skirt. Laughter followed. Maybe you want to cook or mama. Can't tell which. The words carried. Maggie heard them once, stepping out with a basket of laundry. She paused, eyes on the ground, and straightened. She didn't glare, didn't scold, just met their eyes, steady, unbroken. Then she walked on, skirt swishing, chin high. Silence followed her all the way to the porch. By evening, one of the men left a fresh sack of flour by the kitchen door. No note, just a small apology written in action. The next morning, Maggie baked raisin bread, rich, sweet, and golden. She tore off a small piece, wrapped in linen, and laid it at James's door. A note beside it read, "It's blueberry." The baby liked the smell. She didn't wait for thanks. But the next morning, when she stepped into the kitchen, the plate was clean. No crumbs, no linen, just a faint scent of blueberries still in the air. A week later, rain came hard. For 3 days, the ground turned to muck. Still, Maggie worked, carrying the baby on her hip as she fed chickens and gathered eggs. Her hair had slipped from its tie, her hem dark with mud. Her feet were bare. She didn't notice James watching from a barn. "Did you lose your shoes?" he called gently. She turned, startled. "No," she said, cheeks red. "The other one's too small now. I grew." It didn't. He didn't laugh. He just nodded and went back to work. That night, she sat by the fire, drying the single old shoe in her lap. She remembered when someone once told her, "Fat girls don't need fine shoes," and hid the pair in a drawer for years. She kept them anyway, not out of vanity, but hope. The next morning, a pair of small, sturdy leather boots waited on the porch. Tucked into one was a folded note. "These were my sisters." She never came back to get them. "I think they'd rather stay here." Maggie stood there, boots in hand, her heart swelling with something warm and wordless. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She just held a hand to her chest and whispered, "Thank you," to no one. And when she stepped through the yard later that day, the baby on her hip, the mud still thick, she wore those boots. They fit. From the hill beyond the pasture, James watched her walk. He didn't wave. He didn't call. But his eyes softened, and for the first time in years, something inside him unclenched. The rain lingered for 3 more days. Cold seeped into every crack of the old ranch house, making the boards creak like tired bones. The fire in the stove hissed with damp wood. Outside, the fields turned to rivers of mud. Inside, Maggie moved through the gloom with her sleeves rolled high, hair pinned up, every motion deliberate. The baby had grown restless. Cheeks flushed, small fists balled tight. She pressed her palm to his forehead and felt it at once. Too warm, too fast. "Ah, love," she whispered. "You got the fever now." She began to work without thinking, the way women do when they've carried too much and can't afford to panic. She chopped ginger, poured water, set herbs to steep. The kitchen filled with the scent of mint and smoke and something human. She hummed softly, an old Irish tune, to soothe her own heart as much as a child's. The door swung open hard enough to rattle the pans. James Bellamy stepped in, his face drawn and pale, hair damp from the storm. He clutched the baby in both arms, awkwardly, desperately. The boy's cries filled the room. "He won't stop," James muttered, breath ragged. "He's burning up." Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. "I know what to do," she said gently. "It's an old remedy. Ginger water, cool cloth. I've used it before." She reached the child instinctively, but James stepped back. His voice came rough, sharp, like a man lashing out of the wind, because he couldn't fight what really hurt. "I didn't hire you to be his mother." The words landed like a slap. For a moment, neither of them moved. Only the fire crackled, small and accusing. Maggie stood still, the cloth limp in her hand. She didn't flinch, didn't argue. Her voice, when it came, was soft, tired, and steady. "I never asked to be anyone's wife, Mr. Bellamy." She folded the cloth neatly, placed it on the table, and walked out. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, slow and even, like someone who'd learned long ago that leaving quietly hurts less than staying to plead. James stood there, baby cry in his arms, the room heavy with what he'd just broken. He looked at the towel, still warm from her touch, looked at the doorway where she'd vanished, and shame came over him like cold rain. He did what he could. He rocked the baby, whispered nonsense, sang the first lullaby that came to mind, words he hadn't used since his wife was alive. But the fever held on, high and stubborn. When dawn's gray light crept through the window, the baby whimpered and slept. James slumped in the chair beside the cradle, head bowed. That's when he heard it. Soft footsteps down the hall, the creak of a door, the hiss of water poured into a basin, the faint scent of ginger and mint again. He didn't move, didn't dare. A few minutes later, he opened the door. There on the floor outside his room sat a small wooden basin of steaming water, a folded towel beside it. No note, no sound, just the quiet offering of a woman who'd already forgiven him. He knelt, fingers trembling, and carried the basin inside. He wrung the towel, laid it gently across the baby's forehead. The child's breathing steadied. His cries fell to sighs. James leaned back in the chair, eyes on the sleeping boy. Then he whispered, half to himself, "She doesn't want to be your mother, son, but she's better than I ever deserved." He didn't sleep that night, but the baby did, and by morning the fever broke. The next day dawned cold but bright. Maggie was already at work, polishing the shelves in the parlor. Her face was calm, though she hadn't slept either. When James stepped in, she didn't look up, didn't mention the basin or the towel or the way she'd saved his boy. He wanted to thank her. He tried, but when he opened his mouth, the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just nodded once, awkward and small. She nodded back, and that was enough. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't need language. Sometimes it just needs breakfast on the table and the sound of boots on a clean floor. Later that morning, while wiping the lower shelves, Maggie's cloth brushed against a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of newspapers. It fell with a thud, the lid springing open. Inside were letters, old, folded, yellowed, and a photograph. She didn't mean to look, but her eyes caught the face anyway. A woman, slender and delicate, hair pinned in perfect curls. Her smile faint, almost frightened. James's late wife. Maggie froze. Then, quietly, she tried to close the box again. The shadow that fell across her hand stopped her. James stood in the doorway. He'd seen. She turned, ready for anger, ready to apologize. But he only stepped closer, slow, steady, until he knelt beside her. "She wasn't like you," he said quietly. Maggie lowered her gaze. He picked up the photograph, turned it over in his hands. "She was beautiful," he continued. "The kind of beautiful men write songs about. And I think that's where I failed her." He reached into the box and unfolded one of the letters, the ink faded, the edge torn. She wrote this a month before she died. He read aloud in a flat voice. I want to be loved for staying alive, not for vanishing slowly. He swallowed. She thought if she got smaller, I'd love her more. I never told her otherwise. Every skip meal, I said nothing. Every new hollow in her face, I smiled like it was grace. His voice didn't tremble, but the silence afterward did. I didn't hurt her with fists, he whispered. I hurt her with silence. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the kind of truth that makes both confession and comfort feel impossible. Maggie didn't speak. She didn't say you did your best or you couldn't have known. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his. It was a large hand, scarred, sun-browned, trembling. He stared at it, then turned it over and closed his fingers around hers. For the first time, someone had touched him without pity or demand. A broken sound escaped his chest, half laugh, half sob. You're the first person to touch me, he said softly, without a skin permission first. Maggie didn't pull away. She just nodded once, a tear slipping down her cheek. Outside, the wind had died. The world went still. For the first time since the grave was filled, the house in Carter's Hollow felt alive again. Autumn had come down from the hills, painting every cottonwood with rust. The ranch had grown quiet again, not sad, just gentled. Wind hummed through the eaves like an old song that had forgotten its words. Maggie worked as she always did, steady, thorough, almost prayerful. Flour dusted her forearms, her cheeks. The kitchen smelled of yeast and cinnamon, the scent that made a house feel lived in. James rode out early and came home late, but his boots paused longer now by the stove, his notes shorter, his eyes less guarded. He had learned the rhythm of her presence, the scrape of her chair, the hum she carried through every chore. Silence between them had become a comfort instead of a wall. One evening he came in from the cold, arms full of something wrapped in muslin. He hesitated in the doorway, almost shy. I found this in the attic, he said. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. He set the bundle on the table and opened it with care. Inside lay a cream-colored dress, the kind once meant for a Sunday best. Time had softened it. The lace collar yellowed, one sleeve torn. The fabric breathed faintly of cedar and memory. It was hers, James said. She never wore it. Said she'd wait till she was thin enough. He ran a thumb down the seam, eyes distant. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do. But I think it's waited long enough. Maggie's breath caught. Mr. Bellamy, I couldn't. He looked up quickly. You could. I mended it best I could. My stitches are crooked, but maybe that's the point. He smiled then, small, uncertain. You're the only one who's never tried to disappear to be loved. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Tears came, not loud, just steady, like the thaw of winter ice. She reached out, fingers tracing the rough seams. Each stitch held a story, imperfect but deliberate. It's beautiful, she whispered. He shook his head. No, it's honest. By late October, Carter's Hollow woke to laughter again. Lanterns swung from barn rafters. Children chased each other between hay bales, and a fiddle scraped out a reel older than a railroad. Maggie stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing the cream-colored dress. It fit her the way truth fits, a little snug, but right. The patched sleeve brushed her arm like forgiveness. The child, James's boy, rested on her hip, grabbing at her collar, giggling. People turned to look, not with scorn this time, but something softer. Respect, maybe even awe. They whispered, that's Bellamy's woman, the one who stayed. When the fiddler struck a waltz, James crossed the floor toward her. He stopped, hat in hand. May I? She blinked through a blur of tears and laughter. You may. They danced slowly. No crowd, no applause, just the creak of floorboards and the smell of cider and straw. Her head found his shoulder. His hand rested careful at her waist. Two people, both a little mended, learning what it meant to move together again. From the corner, an old ranch hand whispered, "Guess that dress found who was waiting for her." No one disagreed. Later, when the lamps burned low, James stood by the barn door watching her laugh with the women, the child asleep in her arms. He had never seen anything so beautiful, and it humbled him. Not the kind of beauty that fades, but the kind that forgives. When they rode home under the clear, cold stars, he didn't speak. He only reached across the wagon seat, found her hand in the dark, and didn't let go. She looked at him once, eyes shining. "You're quiet tonight," she said. He smiled, just listening. It's been a long time since the world sounded like this. The first frost came early that year. It lay silver over the fence rails and turned the fields to glass. Every sound seemed sharper. The creak of the barn door, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the cry of a hawk over empty pasture. Maggie rose before dawn as always. She fed the fire, stirred porridge, wrapped the baby in his quilt, and set to work. But something in her felt unsettled, like the wind had shifted. The harvest was done, the festival over, and the quiet that followed felt too big for the house. James had changed since that night, not in words. He was still a man of few, but in the way he moved through rooms now, slower, gentler, careful as though afraid to break what they had found. When he passed her, his sleeve brushed hers. When he spoke, his voice carried warmth instead of duty. And yet, Maggie's heart ached with questions she could not ask. Was this kindness or love? That morning, she found the old dress folded on the bed, clean and neatly pressed. Beside it, her carpet bag sat open. Her throat tightened. She hadn't packed it. A gust of wind rattled the window. She turned and saw James in the doorway, hat in his hand. "You're leaving?" he asked quietly. "I thought maybe I should," she said, "before I start thinking I belong." He stepped closer. "You do belong." Her eyes flicked up. "Do I? I cook, I clean, I mend. I kept your son alive. But that don't make me family." He flinched, and she saw the hurt in him, real unguarded. "I never meant for you to feel that way," he said. "You didn't have to mean it," she whispered. "Some things just are." He moved as if to reach for her, but she shook her head. "I've been a place to rest for people before, Mr. Bellamy, not a person to stay for." Her use of Mr. Bellamy cut through the air, formal, distant. She picked up the bag and stepped toward the door. James stood frozen, every muscle tight with the kind of helplessness that comes to men who can fix fences and shoe horses, but not hearts. "Maggie," he said finally, voice low, "if I asked you to stay, would you think it's out of pity?" She paused, eyes wet. "No," she said softly. "But if you don't ask, I'll think it's out of fear." The wind sighed through the cracks between them. James closed his eyes a moment, then reached out. Not to stop her, but to take her hand. His fingers were rough, cold, trembling slightly. He looked down at them, then back at her. "You're the only woman I've ever wanted to walk home with," he said simply. No poetry, no grand gesture, just truth, plain and hard-earned. Maggie's tears came then, quiet, clean. She set down the bag. Neither of them moved closer. They didn't have to. Some promises are made without words. That night, the wind died. The ranch was still. Maggie sat by the fire sewing a torn blanket, while James rocked the baby by the hearth. The silence between them was deep, but easy now, like two rivers finally meeting. When the baby slept, James looked over at her. "You almost left," he said. "I almost did," she answered. He nodded. "Next time you feel like running, tell me first. I'm getting too old to chase." She smiled, a small, weary, beautiful thing. "Then don't make me want to." He laughed softly, and the sound filled the house like sunlight breaking through frost. The winter deepened, soft and merciless. Snow lay heavy across the ridge, muffling sound. swallowing trails. Days shortened to pale streaks of light between long blue shadows. Yet the house on Carter's Hollow glowed. Not bright, but warm, a kind of steady warmth that comes from work and peace, not ease. Smoke rose from the chimney, and inside, laughter, not loud but there, began to return. Maggie hummed when she cooked now. Not every day, not even often, but enough that James found himself pausing in the doorway just to listen. The sound seemed to settle something in him that he hadn't known was restless. He'd forgotten that a house could feel alive again, that footsteps and spoons and the rhythm of a woman's hands could mend silence better than words ever could. One morning, snowlight poured across the kitchen floor. James sat near the fire, boot in his lap, rethreading the lace. Maggie poured coffee, the smell rising rich and comforting. He looked up. "You ever think about going back east?" She smiled faintly. "No one waits for me there." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe you ought to stay where you're wanted." She met his eyes over the rim of her cup. "That's so." He shrugged, a half-smile touching his lips. "Reckon I'd be lost without your bread." Maggie's laugh came soft but real. "That's a poor reason to keep a woman." He leaned back, watching her. "It's not the bread I'd miss." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was warm, like a held breath before confession. That night, she found him in the barn. He was mending a bridle by lantern light, the horses shifting in their stalls. She stepped up beside him, holding a mug of coffee. "You should sleep," she said. He nodded. "Can't yet." He didn't look at her when he spoke next. "You ever think about marriage again?" Her hand stilled around the mug. "I think about being enough," she said quietly. He set down the leather strap. "You are." The words were plain, unadorned, but they hit her like thunder. She turned, searching his face. He met her gaze without flinching. And there it was, no grand declaration, no firelight vow. Just truth, quiet and solid as the mountains that held them. The next morning came pale and cold. Maggie woke to the smell of coffee already brewed. She tightened the belt of her robe and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The fire crackled low, and there, on the table beside her usual cup, sat a small gold ring. Simple, no stone, just polished smooth, gleaming in the early light. Her breath caught. She looked around, no sign of James. Then from the front room, she heard a soft laugh, the baby's, bubbling and bright. She smiled, the sound like light touching her. Maggie picked up the ring, turned it in her hand. It was warm from the fire, fitting easily against her skin. She set it back down and sat, sipping her coffee, waiting. James came in a few minutes later, hair damp, the baby on his hip. He looked almost nervous. "You didn't say anything," he said. "I did," Maggie replied. "You just weren't in the room." He blinked. That a yes or a no? She pushed the ring toward him, smiling now, a spark in her eyes he'd never seen before. "I'll marry you," she said, "if you promise to wash the dishes after the wedding." He grinned, a wide, boyish thing that startled even him. "That's it. That's it." He set the baby in his chair, walked around the table, and picked up the ring. Then he knelt, not because custom demanded it, but because it made her laugh again, and he wanted that sound to live in the house forever. The ring slid onto her finger, fitting perfectly. She looked down at it, gold glinting in the morning sun, and thought, so this is how peace feels. By midday, the house was alive. Maggie stirred stew in the pot, humming that same half-remembered Irish tune. James sat cross-legged on the floor, letting the baby crawl over his legs, laughing when tiny fingers tugged at his beard. The sound filled the rooms like prayer. Outside, the snow glittered, and from the chimney, smoke rose in an easy, confident column, the kind that says someone belongs here now. In that golden light of late afternoon, the narrator's voice would drop low for your listeners. In a land of dust and silence, he chose not the prettiest woman, but the one who stayed, the one who sang, who held a child to the storm, who mended more than shirts or fences. And in Carter's Hollow, under a sky as wide as memory, they began something that needed no vows to be true. Spring crept back to the hollow slow and shy. Snow melt traced silver veins down the gullies, and the land woke in soft greens. The river thawed, whispering over stones again. Life, quiet and stubborn, returned. Inside the Bellamy Ranch house, Maggie and James moved through the days with the easy rhythm of people who'd stopped counting time. There were no grand decorations now, just mornings and evenings stitched together by work and kindness. She baked. He mended. The baby grew, his laughter running through the rooms like birdsong. Sometimes at dawn, Maggie would step onto the porch, cup of coffee in hand, the old boots on her feet. The air would still smell of snow and sage. She'd look out over the valley and think, so this is what staying feels like. They never had a church wedding. No preacher, no lace, no guests. One afternoon, James came in from the field with a wildflower caught in his buttonhole. He set it on the table beside her rolling pin. "That's a poor bouquet," Maggie teased. He shrugged, smiling. "You're a poor bride. We'll match fine." She laughed until she cried. Later, he took her hand, rough thumb tracing her knuckles. "No vows, no papers," he said. "Just this, me stayin', you stayin', and the world keeping us honest." She nodded, and that was that. Marriage in the language of the plains. Years went by. The boy, Henry, grew tall and freckled, his father's eyes and his mother's easy strength. He learned to ride, to mend fence, to bake bread, to laugh at small things. The house aged too, but well, boards darkened by smoke, roof patched and patched again, each nail hammered in by care. It became the kind of place where strangers stopped and said, "Looks like somebody loves this land." Every fall, Maggie still wore the cream-colored dress for the harvest dance. It seems frayed more each year, but she refused to hide them. She said the mending told the story better than the cloth ever could. And every time she walked across that barn floor, James looked at her like it was still the first time he'd seen her, hair loose, boots muddy, heart wide open. When Henry married, the house filled with laughter again. Grandchildren came, soft, curious hands, bright eyes. They'd climb onto Maggie's lap and ask, "Grandma, how come your dress has all those funny stitches?" And she'd smile, running her hand over the worn fabric. "Because your grandpa didn't know how to sew," she'd say. And because some things, the more they're mended, the stronger they get. They'd laugh, not understanding yet. But one day they would. Years later, on a soft May morning, Maggie rose before the sun. The hills outside shimmered in dew. James still slept, the same man, silver now at the temples, the lines around his mouth carved deep from years of smiling. She brewed coffee, humming that same tune her grandmother had once sung, the Gaelic lullaby that had first quieted a crying baby long ago. When James stirred awake, she was already sitting by the window, her hands folded over her apron, the light catching the gold ring on her finger. He smiled drowsy. "Coffee." She nodded, already poured. They sat together in that hush of morning, watching sunlight climb over the ridge. The world beyond their porch glowed wide and golden, as if it knew this was a peace they'd earned. When travelers passed Carter's Hollow years after the Bellamys were gone, they'd see the house still standing. The porch sagged a little, the paint long faded, but the chimney never stopped smoking. Someone always lived there, family or friend of a friend, keeping the hearth lit, because that's what the place demanded. Locals said, "It's a lucky house, built on kindness." And if you came close enough on a quiet evening, when the wind moved through the wheat just right, you might hear it, the soft hum of a woman's voice, the sound of bread rising, and the low laughter of a man who learned too late, but just in time, what love really means. Out here, beauty fade with the wind. But honest hearts, the kind that mend and stay, they keep the West alive. Fade out with the whistle of the wind, a baby's distant laughter, and the slow, warm strum of a frontier fiddle.